Back in Washington, D.C., there's gridlocks in the streets of downtown Washington this week as world leaders gather in the nation's capital for the NATO 75th Anniversary Summit. Now, the summit comes as Russia's war against Ukraine grinds on, with no clear consensus for how NATO should address the war. And much like American voters, the NATO leaders who gathered this week cannot unsee President Biden's recent debate performance and are all well aware that NATO's adversaries saw the same disastrous performance. Well, join me now to discuss this and more is Congressman Scott Perry. He serves on the House Oversight and Accountability Committee, the Foreign Affairs Committee, and was recently appointed to serve on the House Intelligence Committee. He represents the 10th Congressional District of Pennsylvania, and as I mentioned a few moments ago, he's a retired brigadier general from the Army. Congressman Perry, welcome back to Washington Watch.
Well, it's great to be with you, Tony, and this is the 75th anniversary of NATO, but I think, as you kind of pointed out, it's also critical to note that, as it has been for decades, European nations are bankrolling their own domestic non-defense spending with the assurance of the American military might funded by U.S. taxpayers to defend them. So they're not living up to their obligations, but counting on us. And of course, they're also have had this very stark awakening that the commander-in-chief in the United States of America looks unprepared to defend them as commander-in-chief. And of course, we all know that not only do they see that, not only do we see that, but our enemies and their enemies see that. And so reevaluating this untenable situation is even more urgent now that Ukraine's path to membership in NATO is now irreversible, according to her own Secretary of State.
Congressman, I want to go back to that first point you made because I think that's extremely important because this is a kind of a philosophy that unfortunately has infiltrated our government of subsidizing irresponsibility. Because what we are doing is we are funding their defense while they spend on their socialism. In many ways, they're moving in that direction. We do the same thing domestically.
You're absolutely right, and we certainly, as you know, Tony, we can't afford it here. Every single dollar that we vote on is borrowed, and so not only are we borrowing ourselves into debt here, but we're borrowing to defend them when they won't defend themselves, when they won't pay to defend themselves. And as you rightly said, I mean, the French election just highlights the fact that it calls into question the wisdom of the treaty in and of itself, unfortunately, because it was created to stop the spread of communism in Europe. And we literally now have a communist part of a governing coalition who are running a Western European government included in NATO. So what does that mean?
Well, you also have to look at Turkey. I'm not sure that Turkey is a good partner when we look at the problems we have there. Has NATO outlived its usefulness?
I don't know that it's outlived its usefulness. And I hate to say this, I'm not sure it's had a lot of usefulness. When I think back over the course of my life, I'm not sure I can highlight all the times that NATO's been terrifically effective or even marginally effective. That having been said, I think there is room to have a discussion about, who has more at stake here, who should be paying more, and whose responsibility is this? And then, of course, if your own government is turning into a communist government, should you be involved in NATO anymore?
Right.
What's the core function? If the core function is to stop the spread of communism, and you have the countries that are involved turning communist, I think it's time for a reevaluation, if nothing else.
Congressman Scott Perry, a senior NATO official, told reporters that Russia maintains significant advantage over Ukraine on the battlefield. Now, if because of the NATO alliance, that treaty, if Russia runs through Ukraine into a NATO country, that would draw us into a hot war, would it not?
That's the Article 5 requirement. And you would think with this happening on their doorstep, these NATO countries would bolster their own defenses and not and certainly not just depend on the United States, and especially after the performance of the commander in chief that they've seen. But they have been willing for decades now to allow us to take the lead, pay for all the defense while they get to spend on social programs and let their defenses atrophy. And certainly the United States is not in a position, I don't think, and I don't think that we want to be. I certainly don't want to be in a hot war with Russia over European countries that refuse to plan to defend themselves over decades.
But that same atrophy that you talked about that's occurred in Europe has occurred within our own military as it's been more focused on, the woke ideology, the DEI that has infiltrated our military as opposed to preparing them, training them, and equipping them to win America's wars.
Well, you're exactly right. And so not only has the world seen the weakness projected by President Biden and this administration, and of course on full display in the departure of Afghanistan, the incursions into Ukraine, the incursions on Taiwan, North Korea, China, they're not necessarily military incursions into our hemisphere, but their direct involvement with Russia in Ukraine. All that's projected as Biden weakness. And of course, those countries, our adversaries, are watching how we treat our military, and they know that we're focused on DEI, we're focused on climate change, we're focused on everything except for war-fighting functions. And of course, they don't involve themselves with any of those things. They know that the military is the hot part of diplomacy when diplomacy through negotiations fails, and they're preparing themselves for that to happen while we are living on our past successes and thinking that it will always be that way, which is, there's a reason that freedom requires constant vigilance. But
Right.
Many of us are very, very concerned about the trajectory of our military, and we've worked very diligently in the House of Representatives to change it. But the administration, the President Biden, and the left, and especially those in the Senate, they get a vote in this too, and they're on course for just continuing to hollow out the military. It's why recruiting numbers are down, and it's why our readiness numbers are down. And
Congressman,
it's why people don't want their
we're
sons
up against.
and daughters to serve. Yep.
Hate to cut you off, but we're up against a break. We'll continue this later.